Father, we thank you so much for being with us and guiding us here this morning, waking us up a new day. Lord, I pray that you will send the Holy Spirit to guide and direct in everything that's said and done here today. Ask that you will bless us, guide and direct us, and Lord, make us more like you each day. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.
I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go this morning, but what I want to do is take some of the knowledge that we've learned from chronology, looking at these stories, and looking at the reform lines. And so I have some thoughts. You know, this isn't obviously going to be the end of the discussion. It's really just the beginning, putting some ideas out there. Obviously, we would like to look at sunset, but I don't think we can really do that off the bat. We need to look at the purposes of reform lines, and some of these things I've talked about before, but I want to clarify some points that I think are important. So when we look at a reform line, I've put out the idea that there's always a progressive destruction of four that precedes any reform line, and that the fourth is a period of darkness. And that when you have this reform line, that it's a response to this darkness. Now, this darkness always begins in the first generation. That is, there's something that happens in the first period of the progressive destruction of four that leads to this darkness. So it's a simple idea. I know he doesn't like when I stand over there. So this idea that we have something happening in the first generation that leads to this darkness, we know quite well with our line, or under the line of the 144,000, in that we know in that first generation we had a falling away, and we had a rejection of the first, second, and third angel's message in 1888 that marked the end of the first generation. And then we had a further disintegration of the spirit of prophecy in the second generation, and then it culminates with the 1919 Bible Conference and the book, The Doctrine of Christ by Prescott. And then we had this period here, which is where all that is implemented, and we end up with 1957, and we have the book Questions on Doctrine. And then this is this period of darkness. And in this period of darkness, there is some elements of reform, or some seeds of reform, I guess, that exists. But the church has an opportunity here to accept some light. And then what we end up with the time of the end, which marks the arrival of the first message. And then we have our reform line. Now, our reform line is based primarily upon the reform line of the Millerites. That is, if we're going to look at all the reform lines that we have, and we could look at, the reform line of Genesis, we could look at the reform line of Abraham, or of Joseph, or of Ezekiel, or of Noah, or of the kings, David. Those reform lines, the main template that we have to understand those reform lines comes from Millerite history. So the reform line of the Millerites is the reform line. And we are repeating Millerite history, so we are now going to fulfill what Millerite history is showing. But all of the reform lines show those things, but we can't understand them unless we understand Millerite history, right? So that is, what we have to do. So if we go over here and we look at each of these, there's other reform lines I could put up, and I'm not sure how much detail we're going to look at each of these. But the reform line of Abraham, which deals with his covenants, is an important reform line. Because there's certain elements that each of these reform lines add to our reform line. So if we're looking at Abram or Abraham, this is dealing with the covenants. The story of Joseph what does the story of Joseph, so, I should ask it as questions because this is a class. So when we look at, to understand each of these reform lines, if we understand the period of darkness, what would be the period of darkness in Abraham's reform line? Okay, idolatry. Okay, so the knowledge of the true God. And how would we know that? Well, what's the period of darkness? How did we get to that period of darkness?
The fall of the Tower of Babel.
So the Tower of Babel. And so where is Abraham when his reform line begins? He's in Babylon, right? So here we have the first call out of Babylon, right? So we can see that in each of these reform lines, this period of darkness is expressed, the answer to that darkness is expressed in a reform line that gives us some understanding of truth that we didn't have before. And how does he do that in the story of Abraham? What is it that this reform line is about? So even though he comes out of Babylon, out of Mesopotamia, what is his reform line? How is it expressed? What's Abraham all about? Covenants, right? So it's expressed by these covenants that are made. And these become a foundation for other reform lines. That is, we can look at other reform lines and we can see the elements of how those covenants relate to the various reform lines. And these covenants are expanded upon. So if we look at, and I didn't deal with the reform line of the Exodus, which I probably should, but the reform line of the Exodus is important in understanding this reform line of Abraham, because the reform line of Abraham connects to the reform line of Genesis because of these prophecies, the 430 years and the 400 years. And Exodus, so I should probably put it in there somewhere. Let's just put it in here, Exodus. So we're not going to be able to look at detail, because I tried to do this myself this morning. I tried to imagine we were going through this class and we're going to go through all these reform lines, and it's not actually possible, because I can't even do it in my head quickly in the time that we would have to go through these and think about them. So we're just going to kind of look at each of these as an idea and touch on some of the elements. So when we deal with Abraham, it culminates with the Exodus. That is, it's tied together by this period of 430 years of the sojourning of children of Israel. And the covenants that are given to Abraham are then realized in a specific way with the covenant made to the children of Israel. Does that make sense? So, if we're going to look at the story of Joseph then, which is in between the story of Abraham and the Exodus, what's the period of darkness in the story of Joseph? Okay, so let's look at the reform line of Joseph a little bit, because this is one of the main reform lines which I think we can learn a lot about. So here, obviously, we're going to have a darkness, and we're going to have a time of the end. So, and we talked about this before. So when would we mark the time of the end in the story of Joseph? So, and often times of ends are marked by a birth, right? So we got Joseph, and when we have a time of the end, the first message arrives, and there's an increase of light. So the increased light always relates to the darkness. So what is the darkness in the story of Joseph? Because what does the story of Joseph do? What does this reform line of Joseph do? Because it's a chiasm, for one. It's going to end over here with the death of Jacob. So what does this reform line do, this reform line of Joseph?
God's people are going to 6.
Okay, well that's a good point. So one is there is going to be a joining of two sticks that happens. But that joining of two sticks, where do they join? They join in Egypt. So this is about the transition from Canaan to Egypt. So the darkness is Canaan, right? That's all. It's not a really profound darkness in some deep way, but it's where they're in the promised land, but they haven't inherited it, and that they have to go through this experience, which is Egypt, before they get into the promised land, they inherit it, which is the story of the Exodus. Right? So there's going to be, but that's all the darkness is here. So the increase of light has to relate to them going into Egypt. Yes, Tanya.
Wasn't Joseph born in Haran area, Syria? Or Mesopotamia? Wasn't that where Jacob was, serving his father-in-law? Which part of that is?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So.
Well, Joseph was born when Jacob had run away from his father and he had served
Yeah, he's
his
born
father.
when he's with Laban. So where
He went
exactly?
back to Haran because that's
Okay.
where Laban remained with
Okay.
his family. So we don't have the Canaan there, but we do have darkness of what was happening to Jacob.
Okay, so yeah, because it's paralleling in a sense the line of Abraham. This line.
The line of Abraham, you have an exit there and you have an exit at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham actually was to do with the restoring of God's law, restoring of the correct worship, and in the covenant. So you have a law at the beginning, you have a law at the end.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to still call this Canaan because that's where they mostly are in their time that Joseph grows up. So we're going to have the time of the end, and where would we mark? Yes.
So did you say the time of the end is his birth,
Yes.
not where he grew up?
Not where we go. So we're gonna deal with his birth. Is the time of the end.
How do you make Canaan the darkness if he's not born yet?
Well, because we're still considering that all as they haven't entered the promised land. So they're going to be in Canaan because there's going to be a transition from Canaan to Egypt. Right? Because,
He's not born in.
yes, we know. But let's just leave that point aside for now. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but we're just going to deal with the fact that this is a transition from Canaan to Egypt. Right? So they're not, at the time that he's living with his family, they're not living in Mesopotamia. Now, we do know that there's, if we want to say here, the increase of light is their movement. So there's a movement that happens in the time that before Joseph is 17. So we're going to call this 9/11. So Joseph is sold to the Ishmaelites. Right? And we're marking this as 9/11. So why would we mark this as 9/11?
Because of the Ishmaelites representing Islam, the unleashing.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons. We also know that there's Joseph's two dreams that are connected with this. We also know that they have moved in this period of time from where Joseph was born, and here they're in Canaan, right? So there's this movement to ultimately Egypt, where they're gonna come here to Egypt.
So the increase of light, could we say from coming out of Haran into Canaan?
Yeah, we can say that. So we'll say that. It's coming, there's this movement in the promised land, but they're just wandering as strangers. So it's part of their sojourning. And we know that there's 17 years here that Joseph is together with his family in Canaan. Right? So he's here with his family. Jacob and Joseph are together. And then Joseph is sold into slavery. And we know that there's going to be a period of 22 years from when he's sold into slavery to when he's united with his family. And this is going to be, at this point, this is in this period where we have the 2 years of famine and the 5 years left, and there was this other 7 years. And over here in the middle point, so there's 11 years here, what happens 11 years in that happens 2 years before the period of plenty? So
The butler and-
So the baker and the butler have 2 dreams, and it's at this point here that we would mark something. What would we mark here? Okay. Where is midnight? And where's the midnight cry? Where's the Sunday law? Because to know what this point is, this is obviously an important point.
Making a prediction then.
Yeah, there is a prediction here, right? And we know that this prediction is going to be about 3 days. So the butler and the baker, both in 3 days, their dreams are fulfilled. And when is Joseph put into prison? When's he put into prison, Olivine? You know.
After 10 years.
Yeah, after 10 years.
Okay.
Right, so there's actually a year in here which it's just part of this 11 years.
He's 27.
And so we know that he's 27 years old, so Joseph here is 27. And there's this 3 years here. And then here he's going to be 30. So when he's 30 years old, Pharaoh's has 2 dreams. And then we're going to have this 7 years of plenty. And then there's 2 years of famine. And then here is when Jacob is 130 and he unites with Joseph. And then there's 12 years over here. So this is a period of 17 years. And then Jacob dies. Okay, so I know we've gone through this before. But if we're going to place these in a reform line, how do we understand this period of 5 years of famine? What happens during that period?
The people are completely submitted unto Pharaoh. They sold their lands, they sold himself.
And so this is, how would we describe this if we were thinking about it in our reform line? What's happening here?
Type of Sunday law.
Okay, so definitely at the end of this we would have a Sunday law, but this would be the image of the beast, right? It's uniting of church and state, if we want to look at it that way. So that it becomes complete control of everything by the state. And here we would have to put this as the midnight cry. So where would we place midnight? And why would we place it there?
Beginning of the famine.
What about before he goes into
Right after the 3.
the prison?
So you put it after the 3. Why would you put it there? Why when he's 30 and after the 3?
Because that's where Pharaoh has his 2 dreams.
Okay, so
And he awakes. It doesn't say he awakes at midnight, but he's troubled. He awakens
okay.
out of his
So
dream.
there's the troubling, and so we could put midnight there. So in this line, how do we understand the butler and the baker and their relationship to the reform line?
There who are the empowerment to Joseph's experience at midnight. Because it is his experience with the butler and the baker that the butler remembers and tells Pharaoh. It is also that experience, Ellen White says, that makes Joseph he begins to be lifted up when he goes, after going before Pharaoh. She says, by the recommendation of the butler, and also there was an inquiry made by Pharaoh into what the butler was saying.
Okay. So how would you then, so you say this is an empowerment of what? Like, you used the word empowerment, but how would you?
Using it in the sense of bringing Joseph, lifting Joseph
Okay.
up. That experience is what is used by the butler and the baker And God is using the butler to bring that experience before Pharaoh and to allow Pharaoh now to. It is what makes Joseph become the head, his wisdom in understanding the dreams, his diligence while he was in prison, the care that he took of the people. So that experience is like a turning point.
Okay, so it becomes a turning point, the butler and the baker, right? Now, we know the butler and the baker, they're actually exactly halfway in these 22 years, right? So one of the things we looked at last year was that there was these predictions and fulfillments, right? So we looked at this prediction, which is going to be fulfilled here, but in order for that to occur, there has to, for Joseph, he has to be sold to the Ishmaelites. He works for 10 years for Potiphar, then he's falsely accused. He's brought into prison, and at the end of a year, he interprets the dreams of the butler and baker, and then 2 years later, 2 full years later, he stands before Pharaoh and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and it's Pharaoh's dreams then that lead to the fulfillment of his initial 2 dreams, right? So there's a connection between these fulfillments, these predictions and fulfillments to get to this point.
You have 3 days also when he makes the understanding of their dream.
Yeah,
And 3
yeah.
days are going to make
Yeah, so we have the 3 days, we have the 3 years, and we have the 30 years, all with the number 3.
That's why it tells us that Joseph was being prepared. Those 3 years in prison was a time of preparation for Joseph, for him to become a good leader.
Okay, so here there's a period of preparation so he can give a message at midnight. Now, how would this parallel with Millerite history? Because if this is midnight, this is Samuel Snow standing at Boston declaring that it's midnight. So how would this relate to Samuel Snow on July 21st, 1844? How would this here relate to that?
You have the disappointment, because Ellen White says that Joseph was disappointed, because he had asked the butler to remember him, and the butler had promised faithfully that he would.
Right.
And she comments on it and
The
saying that
disappointments,
it was
yeah.
disappointing to Joseph, that he had to be continuing there with God's purpose. So you have the disappointment in there.
Right.
You see, as I said, there is an increase of knowledge, not as it for the butler and the baker. You see, Joseph doing their interpretation of their dreams, which is what is used to say that he has the ability to interpret dreams.
Okay.
So you can see a steady development as you did in the experience of Samuel Snow.
At the point where Joseph is being brought in front of the Pharaoh, he's basically given a new name. He's given a coat and a ring and something else. He's getting 3 items, the same thing that Daniel gets.
Yeah, and there's a lot of symbolism in here we don't have time to address. But, even if we look back here, he's given a coat as well by his father, and he gets a coat here later on. And I know there's some connections between these coats, and I can't remember what they are. But, so there's lots of little details we could look at. But if we want to understand this event, one of the things that Tabo brought out is that the symbol of 3, like the 3 days, becomes a symbol of the prediction before midnight. That's the way that he was presenting it. And we know that he also used the 3 days at the river Ahava. Now, he put it on, to put it on a reform line, I'm not sure how he was doing that, because I didn't follow that completely. But I know he was looking at these 3 days. And we saw the 3 days in 457 BC placed 3 different places. And we also saw the 3 days, obviously, July 18th to July 21st, there's this 3 days before midnight. So the idea that the number 3 is dealing with the prediction before midnight, where Tabo was placing the prediction before midnight or the point before midnight, the PBM, is he is placing it here at the butler and the baker. Now, one thing we haven't sorted out is understanding the relationship of this idea of the prediction before midnight and the idea of sunset, right? So we have this idea of sunset. And the simple idea of sunset, in Millerite history, when is sunset? It's on the first day of the first month. And if we were going to compare Millerite history with our history, what would the first day of the first month be in our history? 9/11. So we would have to say that sunset is at 9/11. Now,
Why are you putting it at the first day of the first month? Is that-
sunset?
Yeah, on the Millerite history.
Okay, so why would we put sunset at the first day of the first month in Millerite history?
You have to go back to Samuel Snow's questions that will establish your point.
Right, so his question is asking, how long have we been in the tarrying time? And that's on July 21st, and he's at midnight, and he says it's 3 months. So when is he starting sunset?
He says, how long is the night? How long is the day?
Yeah.
They tell him, he asks, how long is the... So he's using the day for a year, brings it down to 6 months. Then he asks, how long have we been in the tarrying time?
Right, so all he's simply doing here is he's here at midnight,
Yes.
He's at midnight.
and this is October 22.
He's not.
When he's giving that portion, he's actually doing when it's August 15, 14, 15, that's when he's telling those people that we have no account what he actually spoke in Boston.
No, we actually do have the account of when he spoke in Boston.
No,
Yeah.
what he spoke, what he presented.
Okay, so here's the question. What did he present in Boston? How long is it from April 19th to July 21st?
3 months.
So when he asked the question, how long have we been in the tarrying time? And if they were at August 15th, how long would have people said they were in the tarrying time?
4 months.
They would have said 4 months. So Loughborough, when he gives the account of it, he confuses the two events because he wasn't there. And he talks about placing that, he tries to place that at Exeter. But actually, we know it has to have been placed at Boston. Right? Just based upon what he's actually, the question he's asking. It could not possibly be 4 months where people are giving the answer 3 months. So that means it's at midnight that he declares that he's at midnight. So,
Also, Spirit of Prophecy gives account to that. She says midway between the time when the time was first thought to be established, so midway between April and October, everybody knows that she says that the words were given in the very words of the prophecy, behold the bridegroom cometh. She was not making reference to Exeter either.
yeah.
Because
And-
she
yeah.
she uses that period as progressive. She says it goes from, so it's going now, it's progressively taking its movement. And she's very clear, midway.
Yeah, and Loughborough, wasn't there, he's conflating the two ideas. He doesn't really understand there's the July 21st and there's the August 15th. They're just not being very specific. They're not, especially later on, they're starting to lose the memory of what's happened. They're taking these different accounts, and when they're putting them together, they don't have them quite fit, right? So obviously, if he's using Samuel Snow saying it's just 3 months when it's 4 months, then obviously there's a problem. So we have to say that this is the first day of the first month, and of course that's the only thing that makes sense because we know, even if he was here in August, to say 3 months, well, that would put them way over into the end of November too, if that night is going to continue 6 months. So obviously we have to look at these 6 months as beginning on the first day of the first month. So does that answer your question? Okay. So the question that I was asking, it was in looking at this at Millerite history, to understand sunset, we would know then that we would see sunset as 9/11. So we have a problem in trying to understand this in our history, because if we're going to look at the first day of the first month, that's April 19th, that's the arrival of the second angel's message. And so we're going to try to resolve this problem. I don't think we're going to resolve it, but we're going to at least look at what the problem is. So I want you to understand what the problem is. I guess that's the main thing that we're going to do here, is understand the difficulty that exists. So the difficulty that exists in Millerite history is that the first day of the first month is sunset. Now, in our history, have we passed 9/11? So we would have to say, if we're just going to look at it on that simple level, is 9/11 sunset?
I don't know how you were asking.
I don't know the answer necessarily. It depends what answer you give. It might be right.
9/11's the first day of the first month, so it has to be sunset.
Yeah, it has to be sunset, right? Doesn't it? Yes, Olivine.
Also, Ellen White in the book, Christ Object Lesson, chapter 29, she marks the going forth of the virgins as happening at sunset. Great Controversy, chapter 22, whether in 1888 or the 1911, she says the going forth of the virgin is answered to by the widespread reformation that took place under the first angel's message. But in Christ Object Lesson, she, when beginning that narrative, she says it is at sunset.
Okay.
She says all the virgins went forth, they all have a call, a name, a lamp, and all profess to be doing service for God. They have 4 things.
Okay.
So she's marking as well where the going forth. And so for me, the going forth of the virgins was not at the first day of
The first day of the first month.
So she's marking August 11th, 1840 as well as sunset.
Okay, so Olivine's brought into the mix this idea, which, and we need to examine it. We need to look at what she's saying. So if I could sort of explain what she's saying, at least how I understand it, is she saying that Ellen White marks the going forth of the virgins at sunset, and she places that at August 11th, 1840. Yes, Parminder.
What's the reference to that? So we can read
Yeah,
it.
the references, we need those references. Do you know what
You
the...
have
Christ
Christ Object Lesson, chapter 29, I can pull up.
Okay, so if we look in Christ...
Right at the beginning of it.
Does she
Okay.
say sunset?
Yes, sir. She says the sun
That's
is...
it.
I'll find it real big.
Okay, so this is an idea that maybe some of us haven't thought about. But we also know that 9/11 is symbolized by August 11th, 1840 as well. So
You saying that sunset is 9/11 is what you're saying in this example, or did I hear that incorrect?
well, yeah, we have two different ways that we can mark 9/11 as sunset according to what Olivine is
No,
saying.
I
So,
get that,
yeah.
but does it apply on any other line?
Yeah, that's what we want to look at. So we don't have the answer to that yet.
It says
Chris,
405.1.
Yeah.
Christ with his disciples is seated upon the Mount of Olives. The sun has set behind the mountains, and the heavens are curtained with the shades of evening.
Okay.
And she goes into
Okay, I
the
see
narrative.
how you apply that. Okay, Parminder.
That doesn't make it August the 15th.
August
I
the
said in my mind.
I
So
mean
wasn't
August
just
11th,
making it an
1840.
established point. I didn't say August 15th.
Oh, August
11th,
11th.
1840. Okay.
So August the 11th is sunset.
If we look at the story of Lot,
Mhm.
and when the 2 angels, where do we place the 2 angels going into Sodom?
Okay, so when we deal with the line of Abraham, we actually have, just like the line of Christ, and lots of lines, we have stories in the middle of these that we can address. And I don't take that in how I look at the line of Abraham dealing with the covenants. I look at those events, they typify something, but I don't put them on the line, on the whole line, because that line's a bigger line. So we'd have to have a smaller line. But the question is,
The question I'm asking is, we would normally mark the 2 angels going into Sodom at 9/11, right? Representing the 2 angels, the second angel's message, because
Mhm.
that's where it arrives.
yeah,
And they arrive in Sodom typically at evening.
Before sunset.
It's at evening that
Yeah,
they
it
arrive
is,
in Sodom.
yeah, just at sunset,
Yeah.
we would say. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of things we have to think about. You know, and it's interesting, I'll get to your question here. You know, when we started to understand midnight, we never satisfactorily went back to all our reform lines and found where midnight was, right? Because we've just been dealing with so many different things. And, we have done it with some lines, but we haven't done it in any organized fashion. Now, as we start to look at this sunset in understanding it, it's pretty difficult if we haven't already established where midnight is in a reform line. That is, some of the reform lines, the way that we've looked at them, we now have to re-examine them just in the light of midnight. But then, if we haven't done that, it's hard to bring sunset into it. So it's going to take some time, and I think that's really the process that we have to go through, is we need to look at each of these reform lines, and we have to take out the elements, because within each of these reform lines, there are little stories that we sometimes have used marking the bigger reform line, but they're actually fractals within a reform line that give us some detail. So, Sharmila, you had a question or comment?
The 3 months in between October midway and the first day of the first, is that 3 months in between?
Yeah, there's 3 months
So
from
wouldn't that
here.
that's August, and that should be June.
This is April 19th. 3 months later is July 21st.
In October.
And then 3 months later is October 22nd. Richard.
Yeah, could we look at those references that she made in Great
Okay.
Controversy?
Yeah, can you give us the references again, there, all of you?
The controversy prophecies fulfilled.
So while she's doing that, so in understanding, and if this is midnight, right? Because when we've looked at the line of Joseph before, we've actually laid it out differently. So this is a suggestion of how we would look at this line. But here we would, Tab was placing this as the prediction before midnight, so, we're now placing midnight here because of this is within this 3 years that this happens, and there's the 3 days here, and it's when he's 30 that we're now at midnight. And that's the way that, we're understanding this. Some of this others just is the result of understanding this, that we now look at the rest of this in that way.
Great Controversy, 393, paragraph 4.
393, paragraph 4.
Yes.
Great Controversy,
She
393.
says the coming of Christ as announced by the first angel's message was understood to be represented by the coming of the bridegroom. The widespread reformation under the proclamation of his coming answered to the going forth of the virgins.
Yeah. So the going forth of the virgins is obviously happening. When is the going forth of the virgins happening? So,
She marks it in Christ's object lesson as something.
and how does she do that? Because he's telling the story. So how are you marking it that the going forth is at sunset?
What I think persons may be misunderstand my saying to be is, we have established that 9/11 marks the beginning or the day of the Lord's preparation.
Mm-hmm.
The day of the Lord's preparation must have a beginning. Each day begins with sunset and each day ends with sunset. So if I say that she marks the going forth of the bridegrooms as sunset, it's marking the beginning of that reformation period.
Okay.
And also that day must have an end. We cannot reach to midnight, as in the day of the Lord, without the day of the Lord's preparation coming to an end.
Okay. So let's see if I can explain this, what she's saying, because you probably all understand it anyway, but I wanted to understand it. So here we're saying that 9/11 is the beginning of the day of the Lord's preparation. And so that means this must be a sunset, not the sunset that we're trying to look at. Okay?
Why?
That's what she's saying. She's just saying that this is a sunset. Okay, if we want to look at, maybe we should look at it this way. August 11th, 1840 is sunset, but it's not the sunset that we're trying to look at. That is, in Millerite history, their sunset is the first day of the first month. I know this is confusing here, putting this like this, but if we do this, we can say in Millerite history, this is sunset. This is the sunset that ends the day of the Lord's preparation. This is the sunset that begins it. Is that how you're looking at it? So now if we look at 9/11, we know that we take the first day of the first month and we place it here. That is, the second angel arrives in Millerite history, not on August 11th, 1840, but it arrives on April 19th. But in our history, we have to see that these are both brought together here. The problem is, we have the day of the Lord's preparation beginning in 9/11. It begins with the sunset, but that sunset we look at as April 19th, the first day of the first month, the arrival of the second angel's message. So the problem that we're having in trying to place sunset any place past 9/11 in our history is it looks like we're moving, and some people we've moved the arrival of the second angel away from 9/11 to a future time. Does that everybody understand that the problem that we're having? Because some of you have thought about this before and have discussed it. Some of you may be just thinking about it for the first time. Yes, Pauline.
Another element that I would like to bring in is the fact that the Passover for Christ, the sunset that began the Passover meal that he had with his disciples, was a sunset that marked the preparation day it was the beginning of the preparation day for a ceremonial Sabbath, and it was the beginning of the preparation day for a literal Sabbath.
Okay.
And also she marks it as a point where Christ was about to sweep away the Jewish economy and establish this new feast, the Lord's Supper, for the Christian dispensation. So that sunset marked a turning point.
Okay, so now we're bringing Passover into the mix. Now,
I'm not bringing Passover into it as you're doing it with Millerite's line.
Yeah.
I'm just showing that one
I understand.
sunset represented the sunset for the day of the Lord's preparation on two different levels.
yeah, so you're bringing Passover in, and how we're looking at this in trying to understand sunset. Sunset is a transition, right? It's a transition from day to night, okay? And sunset, in the story of Christ, how many sunsets do we have that happen in connection with the Passover? It's a trick question. How many sunsets do we have in connection with the Passover? That's a trick question too, so that's important. So we have the sunset Thursday night, which we would call, that's the beginning of Friday, right? And we have the sunset on Friday night, right, beginning the Sabbath. We also have a sunset that happens on the 9th. And that sunset is the one where Christ, at the triumphal entry, Christ weeps over Jerusalem when he gets to Jerusalem. And then at sunset, he goes into the temple. And that begins the 10th day when the Lamb is chosen. Now, in trying to understand the sunsets, the way that I've looked at it is that these sunsets are all symbolizing the same thing. But they're marked in different places. And we see that in our waymarks. As we start to look at them, we start to see that they have many of the same characteristics at different waymarks. But it's the context of where we are in our waymarks that helps us interpret the significance of each of these symbols. So when we deal with these sunsets, to me, each of those sunsets symbolize the same thing. But if we're putting them on a line in our time, we can't just, at least I don't think we can't, and maybe she's not suggesting this, But here's what I've seen some people try to do. We have the sunset, so here's when they have the Lord's Supper, right? So you got the Passover with the disciples. And then we have the sunset, and different people play, some people say, well, it's between the two evenings when the lamb's slain, so they place the cross here at sunset because that's between the two evenings. And then, of course, you have him placed into the tomb at sunset, right? So he's going to be resting in the tomb. So we would then try to line these up somehow so that this is, this is 9/11, and this is sunset.
Actually, before sunset, Jesus' body was anointed by three people.
Yeah.
So there's an anointing going on there too before sunset.
Yes. Okay. Richard.
Forgive me, but as far as August 11th, 1840,
Yeah.
being sunset, I'm struggling with that. I'm not saying it's not sunset. I'm struggling with that thought. So I need a reference for that. Looked at the two Christ Object Lessons and Great Controversy. I'm not seeing it in there as pointing to August 11th,
Yeah.
1840.
Yeah. The question is, because Olivine's saying that the going forth of the virgins is at sunset. Now, from my understanding, you're taking, right?
Remember, I said the servant of the Lord says she marks the beginning of the experience at sunset.
Yeah, but how do you do that?
I'm using it because she says all have a call, and the call where she says it is the widespread reformation that took place under the first
Right,
angel's
I understand that,
message.
but how do you place it at sunset?
Because
the experience begins at sunset.
She's
Because
using
the
Christ
little-
object lessons.
I know, but how is she doing that with Christ Object Lessons? That's what I'm trying to
Because
address.
of the little happen.
Because what does she say? I'm not arguing. I was just trying to illustrate how you're doing that for Richard so that he understands why you're placing it at sunset.
So I
Yes.
just want to point out at the little level, the way it actually happened, because this history or this story that Jesus is telling, they're actually witnessing taking place. So the disciples are on the mountain looking down and they're seeing this virgin coming in for the wedding. And this is what she's referring to. At a literal level, the virgins arrive at sunset and they take their place and they wait for the bridegroom to come. So she's taking the literal fulfillment and apply it spiritually in the Millerite history.
Does that help you, Richard, to understand why she's
get all
placing it?
that. I'm looking within the context of a reference. I get the logic,
Okay.
but in the context of a reference, I was assuming that one of the two references given were, one of those was saying that about August 11th, 1840. That was my assumption. And that could be just my
okay, I
brain.
see.
That was my assumption.
Yeah, it's not directly saying August 11th, 1840 is sunset. What she's saying is that the going forth of the bridegroom would happen in August 11th, 1840. And then she has another quote that uses the going forth of the bridegroom is at sunset. So we place those two together, and that's her argument. Yes, Parminder, you got a comment?
It's not the going forth of the bridegroom, it's the going forth of the virgins.
Yeah, the virgins, that's what I mean, yes.
The virgins go forth before sunset.
Right, yes.
So August 11th, why is that
So-
sunset? Because if you're marking the going forth, they're leaving wherever they live. It's not at sunset they're doing that. They arrive at sunset.
Yeah, see,
And the only way you know they arrive at sunset, you can't even work that out from Christ Object Lessons, because it says the sun has already set when he sees them. The only place you can calculate that is from Samuel Snow's argument.
yes.
So I still don't understand why we're making August 11th sunset.
Yeah, well, we're not.
No,
We're not
but
making August 11th sunset. She's just suggesting, that's what she's suggesting. We're not making it that.
that's right.
She's just-
I was
she's just
making
presenting
a
this
suggestion
idea.
and I was saying my thought
Yeah.
is looking at it from that point. I was not saying this is set in stone. One. Also, if it is April 19th, how do we mark the widespread reformation under the first angel as April 19th when it is the
Yeah.
arrival of the second
So
angel?
here's how I would look at it. To me, the first day of the first month doesn't represent the going forth of the virgins, which I kept saying bridegroom, but the virgins, right? It represents their tarrying time. So now they are tarrying. And that's what's represented and they begin to tarry at sunset, is the understanding that Samuel Snow has. So they obviously have traveled before, they arrive at sunset, and they wait. That's my understanding of it. So that would mark the first day of the first month. Sunset is the beginning of the tarrying, not the going forth of the virgins.
But then now, how does it, Auntie says, answering to the widespread reformation that took place under the first
So that
angel.
would be that would be before the sunset.
And she
So
says
before the first day of the
that
first month.
she marks it in great controversy. She says this answers to the going forth of the virgins.
Right, so the going forth of the virgins is under the first angel's message. So when they arrive at sunset, which is the first day of the first month, they're now tarrying. So the tarrying and the going forth of the virgins is not the same event. Okay, Sharmila, you had a question.
In the literal week, when we look at sunset, that succeeds preparation. Preparation day comes before sunset. So, in my understanding, there's a point of sunset. There isn't sunset and preparation can't be at the same point, i.e., 9/11. So, if 9/11 is a preparation day of the Lord's preparation, then sunset would have to come after that. I don't see it being the same point in time.
Okay, so what she was saying, and in trying to understand this, is that this is the day of the Lord's preparation from 9/11, and that at sunset the day of the Lord preparation ends. So if we're looking at Millerite history, the day of the Lord's preparation would have to end on the first day of the first month. Is that correct or not?
First day of the first month, 9/11. So they're the same.
Well, if this is sunset, see, this is the problem. We have these different lines, and they tell us things, and we're now trying to put them together, and we end up with contradictions. We end up with things that don't fit. So I'm just asking this question, because if we're saying this is the going forth of the virgins happens under the first angel's message, and the second angel arrives in Millerite history, then are we marking this, the first day of the first month, as the end of the preparation? Can we do that? When is the end of the preparation in Millerite history? Yes, Mario.
By April 19, we know that there was a separation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Millerites that continued from April 19, even though they fell asleep, they did not fall asleep. Some of them did not fall asleep in careless abandonment of their faith. Because you had like Samuel Snow, and they were understanding certain things, and knowledge was being increased. All right. So I'm saying that there had to be a preparation going on from August 11 that would cause those persons that went on from April 19 to the midnight and the midnight cry to have been prepared to accept the message of Samuel Snow.
Okay. So are we starting to understand some of the problems that we're facing? Because I'm definitely, facing some problems in trying to put these all together. Because when we look at Millerite history, we have a separation of two classes that occurs where? And what are those classes? So the Protestants and the Millerites separate on April 19th, right? So we have that happening. Now, do we have a separation of two classes at 9/11?
Yes.
Okay. So what are those two classes?
This is Ezra. On the first day of the first month, they separated from their strange wives.
Okay. So on the first day of the first month, they don't separate from their strange wives. They do that on actually they do. I understand what you're saying. So does anybody know what he's talking about? Because I was thinking of the first day of the first month in 457. When do they separate from their strange wives? I forgot all about this because I've never presented this yet.
458.
In 456.
456, yes, sorry.
Okay, because remember we talked about the 20th day of the 9th month when they come and they make confession. And this is actually, in a sense, it's another reform line that we neglected. But there's a period of time, and they start on the first day of the 10th month, and they finish on the first day of the first month, separating from the strange wives. So what's the significance of this now? So we have the first day of the first month, and you say there's a separation. They separate from their strange wives. So we're saying that in 9/11, we had that fulfilled. So that type is then fulfilled in 9/11, right? And when we look at each of these reform lines, we can see separation occurring sometimes at different waymarks. But if we look at the reform line of Joseph, we can see the separation occurring at 9/11. What is the separation?
Joseph is separated from his family.
So he's separated from his family. And when is he united? So the two sticks are separated there, and the two sticks are Joseph and Judah, right? Those are the two sticks because they're mentioned in Ezekiel 37. The last half of Ezekiel 37 deals with the joining of the two sticks. And there's one stick for Ephraim, but it's also called Joseph. And there's one for Judah. And so the first mention that I know of the separation of the two sticks is when Judah, who is the one who actually says, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So he's the one who initiates that separation. And they're joined at the midnight cry. Are the two sticks joined in our history at the midnight cry? Yes. And that's because at the midnight cry, who are the sticks that are joined?
Oh, sorry, what?
Okay, so in Millerite history, what two groups separated? Protestants, because the Protestants had a moral fall, right? And that fall was only partial. That fall is going to be complete in our history, right? And that fall is going to be complete. Where is the fall complete in our history?
Actually, in the Millerite history, if you want to zoom in and look closely, there was actually separation even after the disappointment.
Yeah, okay, but let's not deal with that one. We're just going to deal with the fact that the first horn fell in Millerite history, and then the second horn is going to fall, which is republicanism, in our history. But when does the complete moral fall of Protestantism occur? So at the Sunday law. But there is the image of the beast test before the Sunday law, and from midnight cry to the Sunday law, we have the Protestants who are honest in heart and who are searching the scriptures, who join us at the Sunday law and stand with us. So that's the joining of the two sticks. Right? So it occurs during the image of the beast test. So I can't remember why I was bringing this up, but so we have these separations. Oh, that's why. So we have these separations that happen, but we also have joinings that happen. And so the joinings, in order to understand them correctly, we need to understand the separations. In order to understand the separations, we need to understand the joinings. We have to understand them both. So now when we go back to Millerite history, Tanya was bringing up that we have another further separation. So what would that further separation be? What were you trying to say about that?
Snow and Storr working together, and then Joshua Himes and Miller working together. And we know from the very beginning that on April 3rd, when they had reprinted that article, Himes already points out that they do not agree with the view of Samuel Snow in regards of his paper. And if you go carefully look to that history, you're going to see that William Miller and Himes go different places, and Samuel Snow and Storr go different
George
places.
Storrs,
But
yeah.
then you see a unification in the ideas or in their understanding October 12th, 10 days before October 22nd. So you see a separation, but you also see a unification in that history.
Okay, so what do you think it all means?
Well, you're dealing with the priests and you're dealing with the Levites. And this is what I was trying to show earlier, that my suggestion, my thoughts come that basically sunset and prediction before midnight has to do with the priest. Midnight cry has to do with the Levites.
Okay, so I was hoping that's what you would say. So when we look at Millerite history and we try to compare it to our history, so one is we see a separation that happened at 9/11. But Tanya's saying there's a further separation that happens. And that separation that happens is there's these two groups, but these two groups end up joining together. Like these two groups do not separate. So if we were trying to compare it to the separation that we've recently experienced, this is a completely different type of separation, right? So we can't compare what has happened with Omega to anything to do with, because that's within the priests itself. Do we see anything in Millerite history that typifies that? And if so, what is it? Because if we're going to understand the binding off of the tares and the wheat, which is part of what we're trying to understand here with sunset, because as I laid out Samuel Snow's letters, I've had the suggestion that the two Passovers and the first day of the first month are together as a unit, and they represent a disappointment that happens with the priests. Does everybody follow that? Or so that now, if that's true, and we look at our history, and we say that sunset is 9/11, how are we placing this, and why would we place it past 9/11? And can we place it? Can we put sunset at some time past 9/11? Because we're saying 9/11 is sunset. So one of the things that we're understanding, and I think this has to be clear, at least I think it's clear, is we cannot say that 9/11 isn't sunset. We have to say that 9/11 is sunset. We just never recognized it with this symbol before. Okay, yes, okay, I got a few hands. Richard, I'll let you.
Mario was definitely before me.
Okay, Mario.
Okay, another argument to look at is, in the parable of the wheat and the tear, it says that it was while men slept that an enemy came in and sowed tear. And you know, we have the argument that, you know, we identify tears in the previous argument that we've been having in the movement, that we are seeing, you know, the manifestation of tears. Now, if we are seeing the manifestation of tears, when would the sowing of the tear take place? And what is the... It's in a sleep state. The parable says that the tear is sown.
Okay.
So how would we reconcile that?
Okay, I don't know, but you bring up another problem. So 9/11, what happens at 9/11? What have we always taught that happens at 9/11?
Yes.
Don't we wake up at 9/11? Do we wake up at 9/11? So we're now saying
But there's also a sleep,
that we go to sleep at 9/11.
because if 9/11 is April 19, then there has to be a sleep, a certain sleep. I'm not saying what the sleep is, but there must be a certain sleep for tears to be sown, for a manifestation of tears before midnight.
Okay, now,
And she
we
said
may
they
be
also-
looking at a different class, or we may be looking at, because are going to sleep and waking up the same thing? Yes, they are. They're a transition from one state to another. So in some ways, they're similar, right? They're a mirror of each other. How about we say it that way? They're a mirror of each other. So sometimes we'll have waymarks that will have, a birth can mark a waymark, but sometimes that same waymark can be marked by a death, right? So they're the opposite, but they're the same. Okay, Richard.
As far as I don't know, Sister White says that those in the Millerites that fell asleep.
Yeah.
We know they fell asleep first day of the first month, but she also said they went back to the Bibles.
Amen.
And that was one of the things we had established when we was going through the Joel shaking. So we understood that this thing comes, it's a disappointment, and we go back to our Bibles, and God gives us the light necessary to continue on and that work of perfection. But one of the ways I've been trying to wrap my brain around 9/11 and sunset, so I'm not sure if it's accurate or not, but this is why it says there are periods which are turning points in the history of nations. I forget the rest of the quote, but we mark that as 9/11. So we always recognize that 9/11, not only is it a point, but it's a period of time. So therefore, in my brain, the way I'm looking at 9/11 and being sunset, and it still brings up problems for me, but if this is the day of the Lord's preparation, and sunset will mark the end of the day of the Lord's preparation, you can see that 9/11 is this period of time that has to come to an end. And so sunset is not necessarily marking the point of 9/11, but 9/11, we recognize it as a period, sunset marking the end of that period of 9/11.
Okay, so one idea that we've kind of touched on a little bit is dealing with this Passover. So we have a sunset that happens at Passover when Jesus has the Last Supper with his disciples. And we have a sunset later, and the next sunset begins the day of the Lord, which is the Sabbath. But this first sunset is beginning the day of the Lord's preparation. But yet there's a whole bunch of things that happen at this Passover that we understand there's a separation between two classes. So sunset is a separation, right? That's what sunset is. Now, we also know, though, that there's something that happens at midnight. So from between sunset to midnight, so Judas, okay, at midnight we know that that's when Judas comes and kisses Christ. But Judas has separated from the disciples earlier in the evening, right? So we could actually mark a separation at midnight as well, because when Judas kisses Christ, there's going to be a separation there, right? Judas then goes off, to the priests, throws the money back at them, and then at a certain point, and then hangs himself, right? So there's a bunch of stuff that happens. And when we deal with the hanging, we can go with the story of Esther. I mean, there's all kinds of information that we're neglecting to look at in trying to sort through some of these lines. So we're trying to simplify it right now. But what we can see is that if we're going to deal with sunset as a symbol, we're going to say that either sunset is now for the priests, there is a separation that has occurred, or a separation that will occur. We need to understand how that applies in our history by understanding how it applies in other history, and specifically the Millerite history. Right? Because to me, that's, as I said, that's the primary template in which we compare all other reform lines. It's the pattern, right? And obviously you can say the pattern of Christ is the pattern as well. In some ways, it is. We can't neglect that. But really, when it comes to reform lines, the primary reform line that we can then understand all the patterns is Millerite history. So we're going to have to try to stick with that a little bit, even though we look at other things like the Passover and so forth.
There's also a separation when Christ got kissed, the disciples took off.
Yes, the disciples are separated too because they all flee. Yeah, it's a very good point.
You asked this earlier, were the two separations in Millerite time, and we never really delved back into that. But
yeah, we're going to go back into that.
In my mind, and this is the way I've understood it, but it could be wrong, who knows, is that you have April 19th, that's the first separation, and the second separation is October 22nd, just based upon the numbers of it all, that you go from this, I forgot the numbers in the beginning, it's 250,000 to 50.
500,000.
500,000 to 50,000. Is that what it is?
500,000 to 50,000 and
And
50,000 to
yeah,
50.
50,000 to 50.
Yeah.
So at both waymarks, you're seeing a separation of these groups. You know,
Yeah.
a cutting away of the fat, so to speak.
Right, and so I don't really see a separation happening. Binding off of the tares and the wheat happening at midnight, what I see is a joining together that happens. There's actually the movement becomes united during the midnight cry period, but then the separation does happen after October 22nd, 1844. So obviously, in trying to understand Millerite history, the only really separation that we have that typifies any other separation, to me, is the Protestants and the Millerites on the first day of the first month. So that, to me, has to be our basic way of looking at the separation. Yeah, Richard.
I remember we was when we were going over Exeter camp meeting. I remember one of the highlights from that whole time period we experienced was at the Exeter camp meeting they separated themselves from the fanatics.
Amen.
Remember they set them apart to a different part of the camp meeting and all that. So how do we look at that in that light?
Okay, well, so now you brought up something I didn't think of. So now, thank you for that.
They actually moved the tent
Yes.
away.
Yeah, because there was the fanatics. So we know one thing that happened, though, with the midnight cry is that fanaticism disappeared like frost before the morning sun. So definitely the message got rid of the fanatics, but many of the fanatics just accepted the message. I mean, to a large degree. Obviously, there's people who stayed fanatics. So I don't know, what happened to those people, how that happened, how fanaticism disappeared. But my understanding is there was fanaticism within the Millerite movement, and that when they got the message of the midnight cry, that united them. They now set aside their fanaticism and their ideas, and they now had something that guided them, because in that time there's confusion. They just don't know which way to turn, and people are coming up with all kinds of ideas. And so there's a lot of fanaticism that's occurring in that period. Yes, Tanya has a comment.
She's been having her hand
Oh,
up
okay.
way too long
Okay.
now.
Sorry, can I share a quote? It's from Desire of Ages 774, paragraph 2. I don't know how you would take, what your thoughts are, but it says, "At the setting of the sun on the evening of the preparation day, the trumpet sounded, signifying that the Sabbath had begun. The Passover was observed, as it had been for centuries, while he to whom it pointed had been slain by wicked hands and lay in Joseph's tomb." So there's a lot of different points there that are being addressed. The sunset, the preparation, and also the Passover and
Right.
the Sabbath as well.
Yeah, so this transition that happens, now when they're talking about the Passover's past, right? Because that was on the evening that Jesus had the Passover with his disciples. But they often call the Feast of Unleavened Bread the Passover. So it's not like the Passover that's being talked about being kept on the 15th is now the Passover meal. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it's a continuation of the Passover. So Christ has died, and that means all that's following that now has lost its significance as far as it's now a hollow form, right? Completely at that point, because it's missing the point, which is that they just killed Christ, who was the whole symbol of the Passover. The Passover symbolized Christ, and yet they hadn't recognized him. With that, Sharmila, that's kind of how you understand that, or do you got some other insights
Just
into
the
it?
part about the setting of the sun on the evening of the preparation day. So what I was
Yeah, so the
saying-
preparation day is ending,
This
the Sabbath is
sunset
beginning.
comes after the preparation day. That's how I'm understanding this quote.
Right, so then that's the day of the Lord. So that's now the Sabbath, which is the day
Right.
of the Lord.
Yeah.
And now we're in a new dispensation, so to speak, where all those sacrifices have fulfilled, the types have been fulfilled by Christ's death upon the cross that evening, because he died at the time of the evening sacrifice. The lamb escapes from the priest's hands. The veil of the temple is ripped in twain from the top to the bottom. And so now we have that dividing line. So this new Sabbath that begins a different Sabbath than has ever existed before. Yes, Tanya?
I want to point out that Joseph Bates tells us that after the midnight in Boston, there was a camp meeting held in Concord, New Hampshire, somewhere about the 1st of August. And the account that I found from Joshua Himes, it was point out that at this camp meeting, the voices of those who took part were heard from 3 to 4 miles, and words were distinctly heard over a mile in houses with the doors and windows closed. And then you have the Exeter camp meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So this midnight cry actually began at Boston, then Concord, and then at Exeter. It was progressed in 2 steps too.
Which Eleanor's clear, the midnight cry. See, we originally just said, well, because it's empowered at Exeter. At Exeter, that's really when
The high
it's,
point.
yeah, the high point. All of a sudden now everybody understands it. It goes out in power. But there definitely were people proclaiming it and understanding it before August 15th.
Yeah, but you
And-
recognize that it's a supernatural thing. I mean, to hear the voice 3 to 4 miles, and then to hear it a mile with their doors and windows closed. That's just something.
Well, I wouldn't say that's supernatural. That can happen in certain atmospheric conditions, and I don't know the atmospheric conditions.
Okay,
That's,
I've
it can
never heard of
happen.
an account that you can hear the words of somebody 3 to 4 miles away.
Oh,
Have
yeah.
you?
Yes,
Okay,
Yeah.
I haven't.
It's a Canadian thing.
it can happen. Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, definitely we can see that in trying to deal with the sunset aspect of this, that there's this transition that happens when we go from Friday to Sabbath. And in a sense, we can look at, the first one, there's the Passover. Jesus is keeping the Passover with his disciples, just as the Jews have kept it for 1,500 years. And then we move to this new Sabbath. It's the same Sabbath, but it's new now because those types have been. So both of these sunsets, they symbolize the two Passovers to me at Millerite history. That's the way I look at it. They sort of symbolize those 2 points. That there's always this separation that is occurring with these sunsets. So how to sort that out, I still don't know the answer. But you can see where we have to start looking a little more closely, right? So we need to understand the Passover better. We need to understand Samuel Snow's letters better. We need to understand Millerite history better than we do. And we need to be able, I think, from there, we can then go over all these other reform lines and get a better understanding of the Millerite reform line. We can then see, yes, this fits. Now we understand the relationship between these reform lines. So to put all these reform lines up there, I don't think we can do that at this time. We don't have enough. We haven't looked at enough information. Okay, Tanya.
Genesis 1, when we're looking at prayer meeting, we recognize that the first sunset that appears at the natural level is in the creation. And on the 4th day, the sun was created. That was the first day that they had their first sunset.
Yeah.
And the next following day was 5, so we actually have a 45. So the first sunset at the natural levels gives us that 45. So I don't know if that would help us to give us another thing to add on to it. That way we can figure it out where that's.
And 45 then marks, to me, 45 marks the end of the Jewish year 1843, because that's the 45 years from 1798 to receiving the blessing, right? Blessed is he that cometh to the end of the 1335 days. Am I correct in that's what you're understanding it?
Testimony they used to prove their point, because they don't have a second verse. They only have one verse, and then they're using 45 years, the difference between 1798 and 1843, to give them that 45 number.
Yeah. Okay.
Go
Richard,
ahead, go ahead.
Somebody else? Or
Oh, I thought you were about to speak.
no.
I had a another thought I was thinking about sunset is of course it's the Passover meal.
Mhm.
Well, I'm not saying it is the Passover meal, but the food that they're eating, in my mind, in connection with our history, the food that would identify the meal that the disciples are eating would be Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And that, because that's the food that came at the time of the end. And like in Millerite history, there is a further revelation or a correction of something we misunderstood. So you can see that the information that was put forth in Time of the End magazine, God has given us further correction on it. That's the Passover meal, that's the hidden manna. That's Daniel 11, 40 through 45. So if that's the Passover meal that we're eating, the quote that Sister Sharmila brought up in Desire of Ages 774.2, has an interesting point in there for me. And it says, that was a never to be forgotten Sabbath to the sorrowing disciples, and also to the priests, rulers, scribes, and people. At the setting of the sun on the evening of the preparation day, the trumpet sounded, signifying that the Sabbath had begun. So it's a lot of implications in that, because you have the trumpet sounding. And this would be, the trumpet and the alarm sounds at the Sunday law, but we understand midnight is a type of the Sunday law. So therefore, in this quote, the ramifications of what we're saying are very intense, because they have a trumpet sound and marking when the day of the Lord begins.
Amen.
So it's just interesting. I've
Yeah,
never looked at it before.
It is interesting. I just have too many thoughts to kind of even talk about it. So,
But that's what I was saying, Brother Theodore, that the 9/11 marks the beginning of the day of the Lord. And according to the light, the day of the Lord's preparation,
yes.
according to the light that has been brought in, Samuel Snow is marking that point as sunset. This quote now shows that, and also we know naturally to enter into the day of the Lord, you have to have a transition point.
right. There's a transition point that brings us to the day of the
the
Lord. Now,
day
where
of the Lord.
do we always put that transition point before? When does the day of the Lord begin in
Midnight.
our? What's that?
Midnight.
At midnight, right? Okay, is sunset connected to midnight? How?
It marks the beginning
Of night,
Yes.
right? So now, can we then? Because part of the problem, and the way that I try to solve this is maybe not the best way, but I just look at midnight and all the events that lead up to midnight as connected to midnight. That is, when as we approach midnight, we have all these events that start coming at us. Our point is midnight, and we put them all at midnight, but now we see that they're coming before midnight. So that, can we place a sunset that's not 9/11, that's for the priests, that connects that transition? Can the sunset symbolize what's going to happen at midnight? What we used to just have at midnight. Can we have a sunset for us? And that's sort of the question. I think it's possible that we can. But I also see that the sunset is connected to 9/11. So that means 9/11 and midnight are kind of together. We're just separating things out. Yes.
We've seen this a lot before, though, with midnight and 9/11. We talk about it all the time. When we first identified it, we were saying, well, we have all these things at 9/11 that are now happening at midnight. Why is that? We have, there's so many you could list. There's a bunch. But so that's not a strange idea, and I think there is a validity to, at least at some level, the idea that midnight is a point, but as you zoom in on that point, you begin to see that it's a period of time in there. That there's events that take place in their order, and I think maybe that's what we're seeing is these ordered events that take you to the end of midnight.
Right. So
Which is the same thing that happened with the midnight cry, is that we saw the midnight cry, and then when we zoomed in on it, we saw that there was a point before midnight cry, and that we're looking at the point from midnight to the midnight cry.
yeah.
And midnight cry was the end point, so you could
Yeah.
theoretically
And
do
now-
the same thing with
Yeah,
midnight.
and Samuel Snow's letters to me suggest, because Samuel Snow represents the priests, so he represents us, right? So I've said this before, but if anybody says they're Samuel Snow, they're not understanding what Samuel Snow represents. Because to me, we're all Samuel Snow. This movement is Samuel Snow, and it's the priest, it's Ezekiel. And so when we look at Samuel Snow's, the separation that happens with the Protestants and the Millerites, it typifies what's happening within the priests now. That's the way that I understand it. Or it's going to happen within the priests, however we want to look at it. So it's not, when we're looking at this specific work of the priests and we're taking our reform line, we're not looking at the whole reform line. We know in the whole reform line that 9/11 now we can understand as being sunset. We just never thought of it as that. Right? We can now think of it as sunset in comparing it to Millerite history, because we're going to place the first day of the first month at 9/11. We're going to place April 19th at 9/11. And so we have to say that 9/11 is sunset. We can't say that 9/11 isn't sunset, and that there's just some point between that we never knew about, and that 9/11 is not the arrival of the second angel. We can never do that. We have to say that 9/11 is sunset. It's the first day of the first month. And there's lots of reasons why we have to do that we can't change that. But if we're looking at the priests, and we're now looking at midnight coming, we can see that there is a sunset that's typified by 9/11 that deals with that separation of the priests. And that would be my solution to the problem. But we need to see this, how we look at each of the reform lines, so that we can sort that out more accurately. Because to me, the purpose of understanding Samuel Snow's letters is that Samuel Snow's letters give us an understanding of the time that the priests are in, and it shows how that separation occurs and what the issues are that cause the separation. And it will help us understand what we need to do next, which I believe is Pentecost. Samuel Snow's letter written at Pentecost is the next step. That is, we need to become organized. And organization is not going to be a structure that is set up by a group of men imposed upon people. It's going to be something that happens like the upper room, so that when we are organized, just like with the American Constitution, it only works if everybody is believes in a constitutional republic, because freedom only exists if you accept the responsibility of freedom. And so if we're going to be organized, if this movement's going to do the work that God wants it to do, that would mean that there has to be a work that happens on an individual level in uniting with Christ, on an interpersonal level uniting with one another, and on an organizational level uniting all those forces together, so that we have a united message and a united people delivering this to the Levites. And this happens 3 days before midnight as a symbol, as a prediction before midnight. And then when that event occurs, it will be clear who is giving that message. There won't be any discrepancy. There won't be, which group are we now looking to find this light? There will be one group giving that united message, and people will know where to look for that light. And that light will then, is the light at midnight. It'll swell to a midnight cry. We will then have the Levites join us, and then we'll have the 11th hour's workers join us during the period of the image of the beast test, and we'll have those three groups, the priests, the Levites, and the 11th hour workers, standing at the Sunday law as an ensign, right, lifted up, And that empowerment of the third angel will have occurred. And then there's this period of reaping that happens to the close of probation. That's how I understand it. And our time is up. So that's a start, and I obviously have the Wednesday afternoon class dealing with Samuel Snow's The True Midnight Cry, which we're going to look at. But you guys are going to have another couple of months. You're going to have a camp meeting. You guys can sort this all out while I'm not here, and then I can just watch it and find out what the answer is to all of our dilemmas. So let's just close in prayer. And I thank you all for being in the morning class over the last couple of weeks. But let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for each person here and for the way that you worked in our lives. And we're thankful for the people who have been watching the morning classes and continue to watch and have watched for a long time, the light unfolding as the light of the midnight cry shines along our path and gives us light for our feet. We ask, Lord, that we can continue to walk in that light, that we will not stumble and go off the path. We ask, Lord, that you can be with this school, especially over the camp meeting time and over the next couple of months, that you can bless each of the people here who are participating in the work that you are doing in our lives, and that you can bring us together in a unity that is through thy Spirit and through thy power and through thy truth. And so we just ask, Lord, that we can continue to seek you, that we can trust in you, and that you can keep us, and that we can trust that you will complete this work that you've begun, and that you'll complete it unto the day of Jesus Christ. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.